Greetings. I'm Dr. Barney Vincelette, and I have been living in a Futuro House since 1977. The Futuro House was designed in 1968 by Matti Suurinen, who lived from until 2013. In the mid-1970s, the factories that built these houses went out of business. History ascribes this to the oil crisis that sent the price of petroleum and the wealth of those who profited thereby to record new heights, thereupon rendering the cost of the fiberglass resin that was used to manufacture shell sections of Futuros prohibitive. But that's not the real story, and this is my testimony that I hope will set the record straight. The Futuro House was designed in 1968 by Matti Suurinen, who lived from 1933 until 2013. The fascism of totalitarian democracy is always intolerant of anything that is different, and from the outset this architectural masterpiece was met with hostility. The first Futuro House, which was assembled to serve as a ski lodge near Lake Palavetski, Finland, elicited a hue and cry from a public that demanded that the only proper style for a house in the natural wilderness should be a log cabin similar to the Lawrence Welk-esque architectural elevator mosaic, such as one might encounter in a Thomas Kinkade office waiting room painting. Here is a satellite photograph of a site where a Futuro house once stood. An elderly woman flew to Finland and had an original Futuro shipped to Tampa, Florida. She lived there in the house until she passed away. In the 1990s it was abandoned, and the city of Tampa had it demolished in 1999. Shortly after the turn of the century, a Boeotian purchased a Futuro house on Broadkill Beach, Delaware, and had it demolished to make room for a double-wide trailer. In Malaysia, a country that executes drug dealers but welcomes with open arms the Philip Morris representatives to go into the countryside and teach their 2-year-old children how to smoke. I thought they were tough on drugs, but they just love that tobacco money. They're so obsessed with the issue of homosexuality that they encourage citizens to turn in bodybuilders for prosecution on suspicion of being homosexual. Thus, if you want to be considered heterosexual and stay out of trouble, this is what your body had better look like. Isn't that an ingenious excuse for refusing to eat properly and to get off your flabby fat ass and do some exercise? It is no surprise that in 2003 they ordered a Futuro house in Kuala Lumpur demolished. Futuro houses were outlawed from towns and city limits because they were considered disruptive to the architectural style of the community. Banks refused to finance them, and people who had put down $1,000 non-refundable deposits forfeited their deposits, canceling their orders under pressure from their families. Some Futuro houses that were visible from the road were vandalized in drive-by shootings. Here's a repair of a bullet hole from one of these acts of vandalism. So long as society, through its popular commercial culture, has decreed that the Futuro house is unacceptable, we have every right to ask, what kind of architecture then does society's commercial culture have to offer us to live in? I'd like to read something to you, if I may. This is the first recording of Mahler's Second Symphony to use the new critical edition, in which hundreds of errors of almost every type in the previous published score have been corrected. Wrong notes, omitted notes, notes mistakenly assigned to the wrong instrument, wrong tempo indications, inaccurate dynamics, missing accents, misplaced crescendos and diminuendos, and confusing instructions to the conductor, chorus, and soloists. The previous edition of 1970 had already corrected some errors, but the editor confined himself to those changes he considered essential. Even more significantly, he was unaware of the existence of several sources, including the most important one, a score maintained by Mahler that contains his handwritten corrections intended for the next printed edition. Some entered as late as 1910, less than a year before he died. On the cover he wrote that the score was corrected and deemed to be solely valid. It was his last will and testament for the Second Symphony. The Kaplan Foundation launched its initiative in 2000 under the direction of co-editors Renate Stark-Voigt and Gilbert Kaplan, who consulted 14 original sources in Vienna, Basel, Munich, New York, New Haven, and Washington, D.C., tracing the evolution of Mahler's changes. The new edition incorporates Mahler's last known decisions. Special care was taken to include only those changes Mahler actually intended to be transferred to the permanent score. As you can tell, to some people, the arts and the higher forms of culture matter, and they're not interested in how to harvest the maximum amount of profit for the minimum amount of expense and effort. Contrast this, for example, to American Idol marketing country western music sponsored by the junk food industry and the liquor industry. Let's take a quick look at something from Dante's Divine Comedy in Canto 11. We're at the bottom of the 7th circle of hell, about to enter the 8th circle, where we go from the violent to the fraudulent. This was inspired by the banker Reginaldo, who got rich not only through usury, which is considered more violent than direct physical violence because of how it steals from people and destroys their lives, but because of the fraud with which he commercialized the arts, making compromises that stripped them of all their majesty, their power, and beauty, and making them akin to, say, American Idol or pop rock music. This is Virgil speaking to Dante. To him who attends philosophy shows in more than one place how nature takes her path from the divine intelligence, and how its arts, and if you note in your physics well, you will find not many pages in that art follows her as well as it can, as a pupil does the master, so that your art is, as it were, the grandchild of God. When you commercialize art, what you're doing, according to Dante, is the same thing as committing child molestation against the grandchildren of God. This results in the arts getting replaced by commercial entertainment. The difference between commercial popular culture and true art is what makes the Dover Downs NASCAR Raceway Gambling Casino Hotel so trashy, versus what makes the Basilica e Tempio della Sagrada Familia, designed by the 19th and early 20th century architect Antoni Gaudi, who spent his lifetime in the design of this masterpiece, the construction of which is expected to take at least 1¼ centuries to complete. So majestic. If the Futuro House is so unacceptable to city ordinances, to the marketplace, and prevailing culture, what about the kind of houses that are acceptable? Let us look at a few examples of what I call the Joe Fartgast suburbia style of architecture. One of the things you'll notice is a fake roof line that betizens the real roof line by nesting it inside. This structural brimborium violates the fundamental canonicality of architecture that form should follow function. Of course, we have fake shutters and fake lattice on all the windows. Here's another affectation: garage doors that have been molded into fake wood paneling, and windows that have been segmented in an uninspired, unsuccessful attempt to look more interesting. Here we have either siding, stucco, or bricks. A little of this, a little of that in these condominiums, trying to be something for everybody in a prophylactic against artistic and architectural integrity that a building should have. It should have some kind of coherent unity. These don't. Finally, we have some kind of simulated French provincial windows with, of course, fake lattice. The type of architecture, just like the type of music you listen to or the type of theater you attend, is a part of your culture, and it is a part of who you are. I would never want to censor or deny someone that freedom of choice, even if they want to live in a Joe Farkas suburbia-style house, trailer, or condominium. But when you destroy all the alternatives to some prevailing form of architecture, such as the Joe Farkas suburbia style of architecture, when you eliminate Futuro houses, any of the alternatives, such as the Texas Buco domes or any other type of architecture, just because it's different, you force everybody to either live in a Joe Farkas suburbia style dwelling or become a street person. And that's tyranny. Because when you take away from somebody that freedom to choose their own culture, whether it's by making it impossible for the vast majority of people who were less fortunate than I was to be able to choose a Futuro house, or whether you force them to hear the neighbor's music that they don't believe in and they don't want to hear in their own homes, you destroy a part of their soul. You take away a part of who they are. And when you do so, then just like the unwanted importuner who's trying to get an assignation but has a big fat beer belly, then the person who's being importuned has the right to say to him, "No, I don't find you sexually attractive, and this is why. You're blubbery, you're disgusting." And when society wants to tell people what kind of architecture they have to live in, or what kind of music they have to hear, or what kind of theater they have to attend, then they open themselves up to deserving the criticism of what is forced upon them as an involuntary captive audience. Many people think the higher forms of art don't matter, that they don't count because they don't sell in the marketplace. Who needs Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, or Mahler when American Idol, Lawrence Welk, gangster rap are good enough for most people? Who needs the literature of Shakespeare or Goethe, who spent 60 years writing his Faust legend because he didn't care about the commercial potentials for this? Or who needs Charles Dickens or Victor Hugo? Aren't true romance novels, People magazine and National Enquirer, good enough? And who needs the Futuro house if Joe Farkas suburbia architecture is popular enough? And that's the statement I wanted to make, that the higher forms of art do matter. Sure, we can live without them, but all we would do is survive. And what's the point of living if all you do is survive?